Proverbs 4:23 says, above all else, in other words, above everything else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. When you go to the beginning of this proverb here in chapter 4, it starts out by saying, and it's Solomon talking, he says, listen to a father's instruction, pay attention, and gain understanding. Then you go down to verse 4, it says, he goes on to say things that his father had taught him. So when you start reading after verse 4, he's actually telling you what his father, which was David, who was David, taught him to say. So when you read those things after that chapter, he repeats what he learned from his father. And of course we know that King David was a very wise man. And we know that King David had his heart in the right place. We'll talk about him a little more in a minute. But the things it mentions in this chapter are this. One, it says to get wisdom at all costs. To hold on to instruction and to set foot not on the path of the wicked or walk in the ways of evildoers. So the path of the righteous is straight and full of light, which is a path that the righteous travel on. But the path that the evildoers travel on is every which way, because they stumble in the darkness trying to find their way. But he almost at the end of this chapter, he sums everything up by saying, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. I remember when I started working where I'm at now. I've been there 9 years, just had my 9th anniversary. And I remember when I started there was a guy that worked there. He was from Arkansas, and you think I have a twang. This guy really had a twang. And I met him, I won't tell you his name, shook hands, and he said, yeah, I'm a Christian too. He said, but I've got this problem, man. I can't stop cussing. And I told him, I said, well, the problem is not your mouth. The problem is your heart. As we talked about it some, I indicated this to him, just like the scriptures say, what comes out of your mouth comes out of your heart. What's in your heart are the things that you're going to say. So it's important that we keep our heart clean. This is why David said, create in me a clean heart. You know, in Psalm 51, I want to sing that chorus at the end of the day when we're done here about create in me a clean heart. I was looking in Psalm 51 when David said this. You know, he said this because he had committed adultery with Bathsheba and had her husband killed to cover it up. And almost everybody in the church knows the story if they've read their Bible. And they think, wow, you know, what a horrible thing for him to do, yet he was still a man after God's own heart. Because David repented of what he did, and no doubt he wept bitterly because of what he had done. And David was concerned that God would not take his presence from him and that he would not remove his spirit from him, but he could still. And you know, David would have laid down his life gladly and paid for what he had done, but he never changed the way he felt about his God, even though he sinned and sinned greatly. One thing about this is we can take comfort in the fact that no matter what we do in this life, if we are willing, God will take us back. Sometimes we'll stumble, sometimes we'll fall, and many of us may never do anything as bad as this. But no matter what we do, we know that He will always take us back. But what we need to have above anything is a heart that's willing to follow Jesus. And it's very important what we put in that heart. You know, there's a battleground that's going on in your mind. On one side of you, and I don't care if you've served God for 5 minutes or 5 years. It still happens. Even if you served Him for decades, there's still a battleground that goes on in your mind. One side of you, that fleshly side that you used to cater to continuously before you came to God, still rises up within you once in a while and wants that self-gratification and wants to be pleased by doing things that are self-indulgent. And there's another side of you that reminds you of all those scriptures that you read and studied over the years, and how if you can apply those to your life again, and still it will overcome that old self that's trying to rise up within you. The point is this: the one that gets stronger is the one we feed. If we feed that fleshly side, it's going to get stronger and eventually put out the spiritual side. But on the other hand, if we continue to feed the spiritual side, it's going to get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And the fleshly side, because we keep denying it, as Paul said, we die daily to the flesh. So if we keep denying that old fleshly side, the spiritual side is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. But we have to feed the spiritual side. And guess what? This is what we did this morning when we came through those doors. You come in and you give praise and you lift up the name of Jesus. He in turn touches your heart, charges your batteries, gives you the ability to go out there and face this world again. And this is what you need, because if you don't charge your batteries, you're not going to function. Spiritually anyway. So, there's a lot of meaning to this proverb when it says, above everything, guard your heart. I remember seeing those bulletproof vests, you know. I don't know what they're like today. This was quite a few years ago. Well, they had that material, whatever they are, but in the middle of the vest, there was a pocket. And inside that pocket, I remember being shown, it looks like a card that slips inside this pocket. And it covers your heart, that area. So it's a little added protection. If you ever get hit in that section, it's a little added protection to protect your heart. From a spiritual standpoint, do we also need something like that to cover our hearts as well? Because look, if you have a bulletproof vest on and it doesn't work and you get hit in the heart, you're dead. Unless you got a heart machine in your back pocket. You're gone. So we have to think like this when it comes to our heart from a spiritual side. We have to protect that heart, because if it gets a direct hit, guess what's going to happen? You're going to die spiritually. So we have to always be on guard what we take in, because what we take in is what's going to come out. Isn't that right? Okay, let's move on. 1 Samuel 12:24 says, be sure to fear the Lord and serve Him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things He has done for you. Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish. So what happened was, Samuel was the last judge of Israel. And he had some sons that were corrupt. They were taking bribes, and they weren't walking exactly like their father Samuel had done. So the people came to him and said, Samuel, we don't, your sons aren't walking in your ways, and they're taking bribes, and we all put our heads together, and we decided that we want a king so that we can be like all the other nations. And this really displeased Samuel. Not only did it displease Samuel, but it also displeased the Lord. Because, first off, Samuel went to the Lord to seek Him about this matter. And the Lord spoke to Samuel, and He said, they have not rejected you. They have rejected me from being their king. See, this is how it was. Israel had a king, kind of similar to the way we have it today. Today we have a king, don't we? And everybody in the church knows that this king reigns. But not everybody on earth knows this yet. But whether they know it or not, He is the king. And one day, they'll all know. So we have this king, but nobody can see Him, but we can feel His presence. This is kind of what was going on back in those days. The other nations would go out, they'd have a king that rode in front of them to come out into battle on his white horse, and he represented the people, and he rode out with his army behind him to conquer and all this other. They come to Israel and say, well, where's your king? Well, our king's God. Well, where is He? I don't see Him. Where's his horse at? God did sit on a horse, but not literally. And He did reign over a people, and the times that those people had their hearts set on following him, they were unstoppable. When you read about them coming out of Egypt, how the things that God did to Egypt to deliver his people was just unbelievable. That country was almost destroyed when God brought them out of the land because of Pharaoh's hardness of heart, not listening to Moses and letting the people go. It cost him economically just destroy the country because he wouldn't listen. And they were to the point when they were finished wandering in the wilderness and they came into that promised land. You read about nations hearing Israel's coming. And they began to quake with fear. They would shiver, they would tremble because they heard Israel was coming. Why would they tremble about these people? Because they heard about what they had done to the other nations when they came into the land. When they came into Jericho and turned it into a pile of rubble. And now they're coming here. So Israel had been known as somebody that was, they're cleaning house. And here they come. And they were like this not because of anything they had done on their own, but because God was with them. And it's been said many times that God, if he wanted to, he could raise up a country as small as Mexico, and he could overthrow the United States of America if he chose to do so. That's how powerful our God is. But if we have a people that follow him and they have their heart set on him, they can have rest from enemies. They can have peace in knowing that God is in charge, and they don't have to fear these things. But you do fear these things when you're not walking right with God and your heart is not right with God. It's like being on that freeway we were talking about a few weeks ago. When I compared a freeway to respect for God, I'm not afraid to drive on the freeway. But if I get in the wrong lane and drive against the traffic on the 91 freeway, I'm petrified. It's the same way with God. You're going in his direction. You don't have to have that kind of fear because you're doing his will. But when you get out of his will and start going against him, that's like driving the opposite way on the freeway. It's suicidal. And this is what happens with people and even individually, it can happen to us today individually if we let too many things infect us in our surroundings, and it takes our mind off of God and onto other things. All we need to do is be distracted. It could start that easy. And the enemy of your soul is a master at this. Deception, doubt, and temptation. Anything to lure you away from following the God of the universe. So anyway, they asked for this king because they wanted to be like everybody else. They took their eyes once again off God and they forgot about how he had delivered them. Could you imagine hearing the stories, your ancestors sitting around the campfire and telling the stories? Well, I remember your great-granddaddy, he was in Egypt, and he came out of Egypt, and he crossed that sea, and he was telling me about that water. All of it. Could you imagine such a thing? I mean, when you think of the miracles that God did, it's like, wow, you'd never forget that. And if you've ever seen it yourself, it's like, man, I'd never forget this. But you know what? Their hearts were so hard. Did you know there's a place in the Bible where Jesus raised someone from the dead, and they wanted to kill him? Because they were afraid he would take away their position in Israel? They forgot all about the part where he raised someone from the dead. Man, I wouldn't think about anything else but someone being raised from the dead. If I saw someone dead, especially if they've been dead for days, and he comes up and tells them to get up, man, that's something I'll never forget. That right there would do it for me. I'm following this guy because he knows what's happening. But yet all they could do was, we got to figure out a way to stop this guy. It's like, you got to be kidding me. He raised someone from the dead and that's all you could say? You want to stop him? What are you, some kind of an idiot? But that was their mentality, and it was because their hearts were so hard that they couldn't even see something as plain as that. So anyway, they're asking for this king because they want to be like all the other nations. And he goes on and he tells them, he says, be sure that you fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Of course, they didn't. Consider the great things he has done for you. And see, this is another thing. God had continuously delivered them time and time and time and time again. Constantly. When they got into, even when they turned their back. I remember reading in Judges, and I remember he would deliver them again, and then all of a sudden, as soon as that judge would die, they go right back where they came from and back to the mire, right? And so he'd raise up another nation to come in and put them under their thumb. He'd be paying tribute to them, and you know they're doing slavery things for this other nation, and they're oppressed by these nations. One of them, I think, was the Midianites, and they cried out to God, and you know what God said? Why don't you just go to your false god and let him save you? Go to that statue that you guys like to pray to for deliverance. But it says they cried out even more. And God couldn't handle it anymore. He finally got to the point where he heard their cries and he said, I've got to do something. So once again, he had compassion and he delivered them. They were so thankful that they followed him all the days of that judge and then went right back to the mire again. Constantly. And today, we're no different. Unless we have a heart that's set on following him. And this was the difference between David and the two kings, one king after him and the one king before him. David had a heart that was set on following after God. And this is probably why God didn't kill him. Did you know under the law of Moses, David should have been killed for what he did? His penalty was death. To hit 2 counts. One was the adultery and the other one was the murder. God was merciful to him and spared him. He paid dearly for his sin. But God was merciful and spared him his life and still kept his promise to him by saying, you will always have someone to sit on the throne. And of course, we all know that's fulfilled in Jesus. But he kept his promise to David, even though David blew it. Because David had this deep desire to follow his God, even though he messed up. But here we got these people, and again he tells them, if you persist in doing evil, you and your king's going to perish. In another place, he tells them all the things the king's going to do. He'll take your sons, going to take your daughters, going to take 10% of everything, going to just wipe you out. He said, you're going to loathe the day that you asked for a king. And you know what they said? Fine, we want a king anyway. Okay. So he gave them the king, and here he is. But he tells them, if you persist in doing evil, what you did in asking for a king was evil. And if you persist, you and your king will perish. And then we come up to 1 Samuel chapter 13. This is their first king in action here. The Philistines had come together to fight against Israel. And they had 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers, the Bible says, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So they were totally outnumbered. Now, this is not, being totally outnumbered wasn't anything that was new to Israel, because they've been outnumbered many times. Remember, Gideon was outnumbered too, and he wiped everybody out with 300 people. But why? Because God was with him. So it didn't matter that they had soldiers as numerous as the sands on the sea, because God was able to deliver them. But the problem is, instead of realizing that his God was able to deliver this, he was looking around at the situation as how hopeless it was. And Samuel said, I want you to wait there 7 days, and I'll be there to offer the offer of sacrifice. Well, 7 days passed, and there's no Samuel. And the people are running and hiding in caves and hiding in the rocks and hiding in the brush. They're scared. You know, they see them chariots go rolling by, the big old spikes on the wheels or whatever they had, and man, they were just petrified. Why? Because there were so many of them. And they all forgot about one thing. The one who called them is able to sustain them. They forgot that. All they saw was the situation. This, by the way, is something that David never forgot. Anyway, so after 7 days, Saul didn't show up, and he says, bring me the sacrifice and I'll offer it myself. Because he's scared. He says, I got to do something because Samuel's not here. We got to do something. I'm scared to death. So he offers this sacrifice. As soon as he's done, here comes Samuel. What are you doing? Well, you delayed in coming, so I went ahead and offered this. He said, you have done a foolish thing. What did he do was so foolish? He disobeyed. He disobeyed what he was told to do. One thing you don't do to God is continually rebel against him. You're not going to win. So you just as well say, here I am, I give up. Do with me what you will. Because you can't fight God. You're not going to win. I don't care who you are. And besides, if you submit anyway, you'll be glad you did. Becoming his slave actually makes you free, the Bible teaches. So anyway, he said, you've done foolishly. So because of this disobedience, the kingdom would be taken away from him and given to somebody else. And he said in one spot, he said, God would have established your kingdom forever. God was looking for somebody to do this for. I'm looking for someone to establish this kingdom, and the Messiah will come through that line. And it was offered to Saul first, but Saul didn't have a heart for God. I think all Saul cared about was himself. So because of this, his disobedience cost him the throne. His sons were killed. He did finish out his term. He served for 42 years as king, but it was tumultuous reign. And then we have over here, Acts 13:22, Paul's recounting the story. And he says, after removing Saul, he made David their king. God testified concerning him, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. He'll be an obedient servant. When it was time, Saul did there was another episode we read about Saul when he was told to go wipe out an entire nation of people. Man, woman, child, and animal. He goes in, spares the king, spares the best of the animals. He didn't do what he was supposed to do again. And that clenched it. His reign, his lineage of king, it's over. God's going to take it and give it to someone who's interested in doing what God wants. So now he's on his way to Jesse's house to find this next king. So Samuel goes to Jesse's house, and Jesse had 8 sons. And he had 7 sons pass before Samuel. And every son that passed before him, the Lord kept saying, this is not the one, this is not the one, this is not the one, until all 7 of them passed by. When they were all passed by, Samuel looked at Jesse and said, is this all the sons you got? And he says, well, we got David, but he's out with the sheep. He didn't even consider bringing David to the house. Why? Because why would God possibly, what could he possibly want with David? I mean, here he's got his brothers. They were big and tough and burly, and here's David out there watching the sheep, talking to God. And what's he say? Go get him and bring him here. So they go out and they get David, and guess what? As soon as David comes in, God says, anoint him the next king of Israel. The one that nobody expected. In fact, they didn't even bring him to the house. And he was the one that God had chosen. And again, David had a heart to follow God. Remember that deal with the giant. They were all afraid because this over 9-foot tall guy had come out every so often taunting the people. Bring someone to fight me. I defy the armies of Israel. Come on, come get me. Just taunting them. And when David went down there to see what was going on, all those people were trembling in fear, just like they had before. And David couldn't understand why they were so afraid. All he understood was, who's this guy think he is? Talking about my God that way. He was more concerned about the insults to his God than he was about his own safety, or even considering the fact that this guy could crush him like a bug. But then again, if God is with him, and he was, this little ruddy guy could take out this over 9-foot tall giant, and we all know the story. He did. And when he did, it sent the Philistines running. But you see, it's all because It's all because David was concerned about one thing: following his God. He had his heart in the right place. God had found a man after his own heart, as the Bible says, as Paul says here. All right, moving on. We come up to 1 Kings chapter 3. It says, this is Solomon talking here. This is the next king after David. This is his son Solomon coming to reign. Now, there's a big difference between Solomon and David. When you read about the life of David, especially when you read the things in the Psalms about him asking God to deliver, all those, he lived those things. When you read those things in Psalms, he lived that stuff. He knew what it was like to be on the run. He knew what it was like to have enemies chasing. He knew what it was like to shed a lot of blood. He knew what it was like to have to overcome, because he was continually having to do so. So when it finally come to the point when he became king, he had an appreciation for things because he had been on the other side. He knew what it was like to go through the desert. His son, on the other hand, didn't. He didn't have the same kind of life his father did. But his father, no less, taught him these things. Remember, when we started reading in Proverbs chapter 4 today, he goes on, Solomon tells his sons the things that his father taught him. We're going to see that Solomon didn't always take his daddy's advice. But he became king when he was 20 years old. And one night when he was asleep, the Lord came to him in a dream and asked him, "What do you want me to give you?" And since he was very unselfish about it, he said in verse 9, "Give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" God went on to say, well, because you haven't asked for wealth, because you haven't asked for your enemies to be put to death, because you haven't asked for, I draw a blank. Anyway, he said, I'll go ahead, he said, I'm going to give you what you asked for. I'm going to give you that discerning heart. And he did. He said, I'm going to also give you the things you didn't ask for because you weren't selfish about it. I'm going to give you riches, and I'm going to give you great honor. And he did. Y'all remember reading that people came from miles around to listen to the wisdom of Solomon. He said, God went on to say, there'll be none like you before or after. And he was so wise that people came from miles around to listen to his wisdom. He was extremely wealthy, he was extremely wise, and he was extremely honored. But he had one little problem. He loved women. In chapter 11, it says he had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord, his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. So when we read all that stuff in Proverbs chapter 4 about things his father taught him, it looks like he didn't take all the advice his father gave. And because he didn't, he was led astray by these foreign women who served foreign gods. Now, a lot can be said for this today. You know, I remember a lady, she just died about a year or so ago. She was almost 90 years old. But I remember her telling me one time, she said when she got married, the man she married promised her that he'd always go to church with her. So they got married, and you know what? He didn't. So she had a husband for years that didn't follow God. And how horrible that must be to have a spouse that's not interested in serving God. So it's very important for those of you who are single to be a little more picky about your mate and finding one that's willing to serve God. Because if you don't, chances are they're going to lead you down the wrong path. Now, Solomon had 700 wives to do this, and you can imagine the influence that had on this guy. Now, why on earth he'd have to have 700 wives, I'll never know. But It's possible some believe that he married women because it secured his safety with other nations around him. For example, he'd have a king of another nation. He'd marry one of his daughters. And then the reasoning would be, well, he won't attack us because his daughter's here, possibly his grandkids. So some believe was for political reasons. But nonetheless, they had been commanded by God, Israel had, not to intermingle with the nations around them. And he did exactly what they were told not to do. And he let these women influence him and influence his heart, and it turned him away from following God. And the result was a disaster. When Solomon's reign was over and his son became king, it was so bad that God punished Solomon for what he had done. He didn't take the throne away from him, but when he died, he did split the kingdom. The nation of Israel split up into two different nations after Solomon was king. And it was because of the evil that he had done. But God had this little problem. And the problem was this. He promised David that he would reign forever. Now, if he ripped the kingdom away from Solomon, how could he keep his promise to David? Well, the answer was splitting the kingdom. Everybody except Judah left Israel. There was a few that came to Judah from different tribes, the Bible does say. But the kingdom was split now into two nations. And it was all because of the king turning his heart away from God. And of course, when a king turns his heart away from God, a lot of the people that, the king represents will turn their heart away from him. When the rulers were wicked, a lot of the people were wicked. So it cost the kingdom because he turned his heart away from God. And you see, today we have to be very careful, because if we turn away from God, it could cost us dearly. And there's more to salvation than just saying a prayer and carrying a ticket in your back pocket saying, I'm going to heaven. There's a lot more to it than that. You enter into a kingdom that has a king. Y'all know this? And what's his name? What's your king's name? It's Jesus. He's our king, is he not? And we're his subjects, if you will. He purchased us, he owns us, and we put our lives in his hands to follow after him and do his will. That's what this is all about. And when it's all said and done, the Bible does say that there will be rewards in heaven. Remember the parable of the talents. I'm not saying salvation isn't earning, but what comes after, the rewards that are handed out, will be. All you got to do is read the teachings of Jesus to see that. The man that received 5 talents turned them into 5 more. And he said, oh, go rule over 5 cities. The man who received 3 talents turned them into 3. Well, I forgot how many talents there was. I forgot. And then there was a guy that only had 1 and went and buried it. And he called him a wicked servant, because he didn't do anything with what God had given him. So anyway, the kingdom was taken away because their heart was turned away from following God. And then over here in Romans chapter 8 and verse 5, Paul said, those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. So again, like we talked about in the beginning, there's this battle going on for your soul. You've got one side, the carnal side, trying to fight against the spiritual side. And the one that gets fed the most is the one that wins. So we have to decide as individuals, what do we want to feed? What do we want to grow? Do we want to grow spiritually, or do we want to grow worldly? If we grow worldly, we're going to get old and shrivel up and die. But if we grow spiritually, guess what? We get stronger as we get older. Y'all know that? So the idea is which one do you want to feed? So if we're selfish and self-centered most of the time, again, that fleshly side is going to get stronger. So it's very important to decide which way we want to go. What do we want to allow into our hearts? Because what comes in is what comes out. And then in verse 8:6, it says, for to set the mind on the flesh is death. Again, like we said a minute ago, if you follow the fleshly desires, it's only going to end up in death. But if we follow the desires of the Spirit, it will lead to life and peace. And last but not least, we're almost done. Philippians 4:8 says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. So like we've said 50 times now, what we allow in our minds will eventually come out of our mouths. And Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. So if we continue in the flesh, our hearts will eventually become corrupt. And that corruption will come out of our mouths.